Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Nam Acharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Sikaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Srivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopi Nath Shamakunda Radha Kund Giri Govardhan ki jai. Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Navadvip Dham ki jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai ki jai. Bhakti Devi Tulsi Maharani ki jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees.
Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Sri Guru Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Hare Krishna. Welcome everyone. We continue our study of first canto, 15th chapter. Today's text is 31. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Om Namo Bhagavate
Vasudevaya.
Okay, so text 31. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvad Asambhavaha. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvad Asambhavaha. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvad Asambhavaha. Please chant.
Hare Krishna. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Sanshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvad Asambhavaha.
Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchinadvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvat Asambhava.
Hare Krishna. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nirgunyad Alingatvada Sambhavaha. Haribol.
Hare Krishna. Oh, go ahead, Mataji.
No, Mataji, Prabhuji, you go ahead.
Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchihina Dvaita Samchaya Nino Prakriti Nargunyad Alingatvad Asambhavaha. Hare Krishna, thank you.
Hare Krishna. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaha Dina Pakriti Nargunyad Alingadvad Asambhavaha.
Hare Krishna. Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshayaha Lina Prakriti Nairgunyad Alingatva Vad asambhavaha.
Hare Krishna. Visuko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samsaya Lina Prakriti Naigunyat Alingatvat Asambhava.
Vishoko Brahma Sampatya Sanchina Dvaita Samshaya Lina Prakriti Nairgunyad Alingatvad Asambhava.
Okay, anyone else? Vishokaha, free from bereavement. Brahma Sampatya, by possession of spiritual assets. Sanchina, being completely cut off. Dvaita Samshaya, from doubts of relativity. Lina, merged in. Prakriti, material nature. Nairagunyat, due to being in transcendence. Alingatvat, because of being devoid of a material body. Asambhavaha, free from birth and death. Translation. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus, he was free from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. This verse is talking about Arjuna, just in case anyone hasn't been following along. Purport. Doubts of duality begin from the misconception of the material body, which is accepted as the self by less intelligent persons. The most foolish part of our ignorance is our identifying this material body with the self. Everything in relation with the body is ignorantly accepted as our own. Doubts due to misconceptions of myself and mine, in other words, my body, my relatives, my property, my wife, my children, my wealth, my country, my community, and hundreds and thousands of similarly illusory contemplations cause bewilderment for the conditioned soul. By assimilating the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, one is sure to be released from such bewilderment, because real knowledge is knowledge that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, Lord Krishna, is everything, including oneself. Everything is a manifestation of his potency as part and parcel. The potency and the potent are non-different, so the conception of duality is at once mitigated by attainment of perfect knowledge. As soon as Arjuna took up the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, expert as he was, he could at once eradicate the material conception of Lord Krishna, his eternal friend. He could realize that the Lord was still present before him by his instruction, by his form, by his pastimes, by his qualities, and everything else related to him. He could realize that Lord Krishna, his friend, was still present before him by his transcendental presence in different non-dual energies, and there was no question of attainment of the association of the Lord by another change of body under the influence of time and space. By attainment of absolute knowledge, one can be in association with the Lord constantly, even in this present life, simply by hearing, chanting, thinking of, and worshiping the Supreme Lord. One can see him, one can feel his presence, even in this present life, simply by understanding the Advaya Jnan, Lord, or the absolute truth, the absolute Lord. Through this process of devotional service, which begins with hearing about him. Lord Chaitanya says that simply by chanting the holy name of the Lord, one can at once wash off the dust on the mirror of pure consciousness. And as soon as the dust is removed, one is at once freed from all material conditions. To become free from material conditions means to liberate the soul. As soon as one is, therefore, situated in absolute knowledge, his material conception of life is removed, or he emerges from a false conception of life. Thus, the function of the pure soul is revived in spiritual realization. This practical realization of the living being is made possible due to his becoming free from the reaction of the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance. By the grace of the Lord, a pure devotee is at once raised to the place of the absolute, and there is no chance of the devotees becoming materially entangled again in conditioned life. One is not able to feel the presence of the Lord in all circumstances until one is endowed with the required transcendental vision made possible by devotional service prescribed in the revealed scriptures. Arjuna had attained this stage long before on the battle of Kurukshetra, and when he apparently felt the absence of the Lord, he at once took shelter of the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, and thus again was placed in his eternal position. This is the position of Vishoka, or the stage of being free from all grief and anxieties. So the translation again. Again, this is talking about Arjuna. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off. Thus, he was free from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence. There was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was free from material form. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Sarasvate Devi Gaura Vanipacharne Nirvishesha Shunya Varipaschati Deshitarne Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnanam Jana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Hare Krishna. So today we're going to talk about false ego versus real ego. I know this concept took a while for me to fully understand, because generally when we're reading Srila Prabhupada, we're talking about the false ego. And actually early on, for many years, honestly, I thought the false part was absolutely unnecessary. It's just ego. Ego's bad, because we learned from the Western philosophers what ego is, this sense of, trying to control something. And we're meant to give that up. But Srila Prabhupada very accurately calls this false ego, because ego just means identity, identifying, right? So it means the sense of I am. That's what ego means, I am. So originally, we spirit souls, I am, servant of Krishna, right? This is the real ego. And then there's the false ego, when we misuse our free will to try to be independent from Krishna. And therefore, instead of I am servant of Krishna, then it turns into I am independent controller and enjoyer, or I am this body, or anything. I am separate, from Krishna. So Srila Prabhupada very nicely describes the difference between false ego and real ego in a couple of purports. The first purport I'm going to read from is actually just a great group of verses. It's from the 13th chapter. The verses are 8 through 12, and it lists 20 items of knowledge. And it then states that aside from these 20 items, everything else is nescience, right? Everything else is ignorance. So if you're cultivating anything outside of what is given in verses 8 through 12 of Bhagavad Gita chapter 13, then you're actually cultivating nescience, right? So this is just a very good verse for us to revisit at any point. Oh, are we bringing it up? Hare Krishna. Okay. Yeah. So, well, okay. Then before I start talking about that, then I will just say, because I wasn't going to actually, hold on, let me get rid of it. I wasn't actually going to read the verse. The purport, though, I will say is amazing. So you could just read through this list. You see it's humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, etc. And we might think, okay, yeah, these are really nice qualities. You know, these are qualities that, you know, we might want to develop. And we can see how they are knowledge. But Srila Prabhupada in his purport, he's very, very carefully defines each of these things so that we use them properly in Krishna's service. Not just that we are humble for humility's sake, right? Or just tolerant just because, you know, it's the nice thing to do. But so, for example, nonviolence, when Srila Prabhupada talks about nonviolence, he says that most people would think nonviolence means, you know, not committing violence to people, not committing harm to others, like killing other living beings like that. But Srila Prabhupada points out that real nonviolence means that if you have Krishna consciousness and you're not giving it to everyone you meet, that's actually violence, because you have exactly what they need. They are eternal spirit souls. And they're just searching after an opportunity to regain that original consciousness. So if you have that knowledge and you're actually not giving it to others, that's violence. And so Srila Prabhupada very accurately defines what each of these points are connected with Krishna, not just, you know, in their own. And so one thing I used to do, maybe some of you have heard me give out this homework assignment before, but it's a really nice exercise that we can all do, is first we think of a devotee who really inspires us, right? So someone that just, you know, every time we think of them, we're just so inspired to become better devotees of Krishna, right? So we think of a person, first of all, devotee that we're inspired by. Then we go through a list like this, or the 26 qualities of the Vaishnava, or, you know, there's many lists that we can go through, but this is a really good one because this talks about what knowledge is and anything else is nescience. So say we go through this list and then we think, okay, what about this particular devotee who inspires me? Which quality on this list is the most inspiring to me? Which one do they just embody, right? And so we think, okay, I have this devotee, Krishna Prabhu, in my head. And let's go with tolerance, okay? So they're very intolerant, right? So I've observed that, you know, I'll be speaking with this Prabhu and then someone will come up just who is very inimical toward them and treat them just completely, you know, in a improper way. And this Krishna Prabhu, he's always just very tolerant. And you can tell that it's not the kind of tolerance where, you know, the person goes away and then they're thinking, you know, what the nerve of that person? Who do they think they are to come up to me like that? No, it's the kind of tolerance where it's not just the facade of being nice and polite. It's actually that they understand that the person that's coming to them with this inimical mood, it's not actually their fault. They're a delivery person of karma. So they shouldn't be mad at the messenger of their karma. And not only that, they're understanding that due to their previous activities, they should have gotten a much less, pleasing encounter. In other words, it should have been much more vile and abrasive, right? But because this devotee has a connection with Krishna, then he's just getting a portion of what it was deserved to them, right? So they're not tolerant just to be polite or just because it's the right thing to do in society. They actually understand that the things that are coming to them are actually deserved, and actually they deserve much worse. And thanks to Krishna, then they're just getting a small portion. So we have the person in mind who we're inspired by, we have the quality, and we see the quality's connection to Krishna, not that it's just on the surface, right? We see the deep connection and how it's connected to Krishna. Then the actual exercise is, once we've observed that and we narrowed it down, then in our daily lives, we try to exercise this, right? So someone comes to us in this situation and they're not dealing with us in a way that we appreciate. So instead of reacting the way we would normally react, we think of that particular devotee, we think of this particular verse, and we think of that connection that that devotee has, understanding how he understands that it's actually just, this is just a messenger of my karma, I deserve much worse, and therefore this is Krishna's mercy. And so thinking in that way, then trying to be tolerant, after doing that a few times, just you'll actually observe that not only do you feel better about the situation, the other person will also feel better about the situation. Basically, everybody feels better about the situation when we connect everything to Krishna, right? So when we do these things for the right reason. Otherwise, if without Srila Prabhupada's purport, for example, we may read this list and we may think, okay, I should be tolerant. And then we may be that false kind of tolerant where someone comes up to us and we just very politely listen and nod and smile. But then once they walk away, we're thinking, the nerve of that person, who do they think they are coming up to me like that, and complaining to others? No, that's not tolerance. That's something different. So this is just a really good verse to refer to with that exercise. Now, that being said, I'm just going to read a very small portion of the purport, which it's actually referring to the part where it says, I guess, being free from false ego. Yeah, there it is. Absence of false ego, right there in the middle. So the section in the purport is this. False ego means accepting this body as oneself. When one understands that he is not his body and his spirit soul, he comes to his real ego. Ego is there. False ego is condemned, but not real ego. In the Vedic literature, Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad 1.4.10, it is said, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, I am spirit. This I am, the sense of self, also exists in the liberated stage of self-realization. This sense of I am is ego, but when the sense of I am is applied to the false body, it is false ego. When the sense of self is applied to reality, that is real ego. Pardon me. There are some philosophers who say we should give up our ego, but we cannot give up our ego because ego means identity. We ought to, of course, give up the false identification with the body. So that's Srila Prabhupada's take on, or his explanation of false ego versus real ego in that particular verse, Bhagavad Gita, 13th chapter, verses 8 through 12 purport. Then Srila Prabhupada, he basically says the same thing in his purport to Srimad Bhagavatam 3:27-13, but he goes a little bit deeper with it. So I'm gonna read that one too, and then we'll talk more about false ego versus real ego. So Srila Prabhupada writes, the conditioned soul thinks, quote, I am this body, end quote. But a liberated soul thinks, I am not this body, I am spirit soul. This I am is called ego, or identification of the self. I am this body, or everything in relationship to this body is mine, is called false ego. But when one is self-realized and thinks that he is an eternal servitor of the Supreme Lord, that identification is real ego. One conception is in the darkness of the threefold qualities of material nature, goodness, passion, and ignorance. And the other is in the pure state of goodness called Shuddha Sattva, or Vasudev. When we say that we give up our ego, this means that we give up our false ego, but real ego is always present. When one is reflected through the material contamination of the body and mind in false identification, he is in the conditioned state. But when he is reflected in the pure stage, he is called liberated. The identification of oneself with one's material possessions in the conditional stage must be purified, and one must identify himself in relationship with the Supreme Lord. In the conditioned state, one accepts everything as an object of sense gratification, and in the liberated stage, one accepts everything for the service of the Supreme Lord. Right? So there's, again, the difference between the false ego and the real ego. When one is misusing his free will and is operating under false ego, then that means we have to deal with the three modes of material nature. When one is in the Vishuddha Sattva, or the Vasudev state, that means that one is receiving their nourishment from Krishna, the actual source, right? So, regarding that, very recently, I'm teaching in a Sri Upanishad class, and a Bhagavad Gita class in Mayapur. And so there are a couple points in our study guide that really kind of drove this point home even further. And so in Srila Prabhupada's purport to Mantra 1 of Upanishad, he writes, and this is a really heavy statement, and I'm going to read it twice because it's so brilliant the way he says it. The root of sin is deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. I'll read it again. The root of sin is deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. Right? So that's the root of all sin. Essentially, it means exercising our free will in the negative direction, to think that I am independent from Krishna. That's the root of all sin. Deliberately disobeying the laws of nature by disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. In other words, claiming proprietorship for ourselves. I control and I enjoy anything, right? Then, in Sri Tattva Sutra, which is Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has written a thematic study of Sri Upanishad. So instead of going systematically from the beginning to the end, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur has this tendency where he divides these different scriptures into Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. And then so he goes through them thematically. So first he'll go through the verses which are referring to Sambandha, which, they're not the first verses, they actually come a little later. Then the verses that apply to Abhideya, then Prayojana. So in this book, Sri Tattva Sutra, in one of his commentaries to Sutra number 4, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur writes, inquiry after the supreme reality is the root of spiritual advancement, right? So we've already read about the root of sin, and now we've read about the root of spiritual advancement. It's inquiry after the supreme reality. So if we're inquiring into the supreme and we're understanding our sambandha, our relationship, our what our position is, what the Supreme Lord's position is, what our relationship is, then that is the root of spiritual advancement. The root of sin is ignoring that relationship and thinking that we are individual proprietors and enjoyers of things, right? So again, false ego, real ego. So the root of the false ego and then the root of reawakening the real ego is inquiry into the supreme, right? So that's pointed out by Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So root, obviously, it means basically where it's coming from, that's there, but it also means where we're getting our nourishment from, right? That's the roots of the trees, they draw up the water, and then the nourishment is distributed throughout the tree. So in Bhagavad Gita, 15th chapter, the very beginning, I think it's the first 6 verses or so, we read about this imperishable banyan tree, right? And its roots are upwards and its branches are down and its leaves are the Vedakins, etc. And so Srila Prabhupada explains that this upside down banyan tree is actually, it's the material world, which is reflected from the spiritual world, which is the actual banyan tree. So then we have the actual banyan tree, and then reflected on water is this tree of the material world, right? And so when this tree is being further described, it says that it has its roots growing in all these different directions. And as long as one is within this material realm or identifying with the material realm, the reflection, then those roots are actually getting their nourishment from the 3 modes of material nature, right? Whereas if one understands the real tree, then the roots are getting nourishment from actual knowledge of the Supreme Lord, right? And so in the 15th chapter, the water which the original tree is reflected upon is desire, right? Our desire to live independently from Krishna. And it is to be cut down with the weapon of detachment, asanga shastriya, right? So being detached from this material world and attached to Krishna, we are to get rid of that desire that is separate from Krishna and then return to him. So where we get our nourishment from, that will determine where we progress to. So let's see what else I wanted to. Okay. Right. So as long as we're enamored with the reflection of that tree, in other words, as long as we're here in the material world, we have to deal with the modes of nature. That's just, how it is. We have no choice. And the process of devotional service, when done properly, purifies us of the modes, right? So we're inquiring after the absolute. We see how each and everything that we are in contact with can be used in Krishna service. When we successfully engage that in Krishna service, then we lose the attachment to it, thus freeing ourselves from those particular modes, whatever that particular attachment had. And then so gradually we keep doing this a lot, and we become free from the modes of nature as Arjuna is being described in this verse. But if even while doing external devotional activities like, sweeping the temple room or things like that, if we are not focusing our consciousness actually on serving Krishna, then we are still being controlled by the modes of nature. So that's why it's important for us to learn about the modes of nature, how they work, and then how to effectively get beyond them, right? So Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita 7:14, Daivihesha gunamayi mamamaya dharatya, that the modes of material nature are very difficult to overcome, but one who's surrendered unto him can easily cross beyond, right? So it's the matter of consciousness, right? So that being said, I'm going to read through the lines of this original purport again, today's verse, and then just comment a little more on those. Because really, once we have this knowledge that I just gave from Bhagavad Gita and Shriyas Upanishad, and then hear basically the same purport, then it essentially gives us a deeper understanding. So I'm just going to read a few of the lines. So it begins, doubts of duality begin from the misconception of the material body, which is accepted as the self by less intelligent persons, right? So all of these doubts of duality come from identifying with the body, right? By misusing that free will, by having the false ego instead of the real ego, the polluted consciousness. Then the most foolish part of our ignorance is our identifying this material body with the self. Right. So to think that we are actually this material body, most foolish part of our ignorance. Then Srila Prabhupada gives us the solution to this by assimilating the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita. So in the words of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, inquiring after the supreme truth being the root of our liberation. Then by assimilating the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, one is sure to be released from such bewilderment. Because real knowledge is knowledge that the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, Lord Krishna, is everything, including oneself, right? So Krishna is everywhere. And so as long as we're identifying with the false ego, then we're seeing everything as separate from Krishna. And then we're using it as if it is separate from Krishna, as if we can control and enjoy it ourselves. But when we inquire into the absolute by assimilating the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, then we're taking nourishment from this, from the liberated point of view, and there's no more bewilderment, right? Because there's real knowledge. Everything is part of Krishna. So now I can understand how I can use each of these things in Krishna's service. Then skipping down a bit, by attainment of absolute knowledge, one can be in association with the Lord constantly, even in his present life, simply by hearing, chanting, thinking of, and worshiping the Supreme Lord. One can see him, one can feel his presence, even in this present life, simply by understanding the Advaya Gnan Lord, or the Absolute Lord. Although the process of devotional service, which begins with hearing, through the process of devotional service, which begins with hearing about him. Then Lord Chaitanya says that simply by chanting the holy name of the Lord, one can at once wash off the dust of the mirror of pure consciousness. And as soon as the dust is removed, one is at once freed from all material conditions. So this is obviously referring to Shikshastaka verse 1, Chaito Darpana Marjanam, So again, inquiring into the absolute truth, understanding who we are, who Krishna is, what our relationship is, and then working on that knowledge. Then we come to this platform where all of the dust on the mirror of our pure consciousness is then removed, again, becoming free from the three modes of material nature. Srila Prabhupada continues, to become free from material conditions means to liberate the soul. As soon as one is therefore situated in absolute knowledge, his material conception of life is removed, or he emerges from a false conception of life. So this cultivation of knowledge is extremely important. Study of Bhagavad Gita, study of Srimad Bhagavatam, taking instructions from the Guru, following the examples of the sadhus. It's extremely important because that means that's where we're getting our nourishment from. If we're not putting our attention in those things, that means we will be getting our nourishment from the three modes of material nature. We will be looking for it from an outside source, right? And so in that state, it just causes further bondage. We think that we're putting effort into getting out of this material world. But if it's not coming through Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra and the process of chanting Hare Krishna, the Chaito Darpana Marjana process, then it actually can't remove the power of the material nature. Daivihyesha gunamai. It's very difficult to overcome. Only by surrendering to Krishna can one easily cross beyond it, right? So this connection has to be there. This is why it's very important for us to engage in the cultivation of knowledge, and to increase that as time goes on, to increase our attachment to acquiring knowledge and accumulating and progressing on this devotional path, and losing that taste for feeding off of the three modes of material nature. Then Srila Prabhupada continues, thus the function of the pure soul is revived in spiritual realization. This practical realization of the living being is made possible due to his becoming free from the reaction of the three modes of material nature, namely goodness, passion, and ignorance, right? So when we act in knowledge, then we're no longer controlled by the three modes of nature. That's what's being pointed out here. And that's why Arjuna is in such a proper state as described in this verse. And then just the end of the purport. One is not able to feel the presence of the Lord in all circumstances until one is endowed with the required transcendental vision made possible by devotional service prescribed in the revealed scriptures, right? So it has to come from the revealed scriptures. We spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, the difference between Laukika Shraddha and Shastriya Shraddha, right? So Laukika Shraddha, it's faith, and it can even be very strong faith, meaning it can be where, I have very strong faith and you can't convince me otherwise no matter what, but I can't necessarily explain why I have that faith. It's blind, but it's strong because, it's unshaking. It can be, in other words. But Shastriya Shraddha, faith that's based on the Shastra, then that's actually strong because then you can actually explain why you have that faith based on Shastra, not just by some sentiment or by some whimsical anuman, some logical presentation that you've come up with that's not connected to Shastra, or by your sense perception. Maybe you've had some sort of experience and then therefore you have some sort of faith. Not based on that, that's Laukika Shraddha, but Shastriya Shraddha. This is where faith actually becomes dynamic and our spiritual growth happens at a much more rapid rate. Then Srila Prabhupada continues, Arjuna had attained this stage long before on the battle of Kurukshetra, and when he apparently felt the absence of the Lord, right? In other words, he didn't really feel the absence of the Lord. He says apparently felt the absence of the Lord. The Lord, in his personal form, left the material world in that particular form, but he's present within everything, and Arjuna understands that. So that's why it says, when he apparently felt the absence of the Lord, right? Then continuing, he at once took shelter of the instructions of the Bhagavad Gita, and thus again was placed in his original position. So this consciousness of not being affected by the modes of nature and being situated in knowledge. This is the position of Vishoka, or the stage of being freed from all grief and anxiety, also known as the Brahma Bhuta platform. So the verse one last time. Because of his possessing spiritual assets, the doubts of duality were completely cut off, right? So he's no longer affected by happiness, distress, heat, cold, etc. Thus, he was freed from the three modes of material nature and placed in transcendence, right? Because he's situated in knowledge. He's not getting nourishment from the three modes of nature. He's getting his nourishment straight from the absolute transcendence. Continuing, there was no longer any chance of his becoming entangled in birth and death, for he was freed from material form, right? So this is also the position that all of us as aspiring devotees are trying to get to. Sorry, the jackals, I don't know if you hear them, but they're quite loud. So we need to follow Arjuna's example. We have to cultivate knowledge, and we have to make that the thing in our life. It can't just be a part of our life, cultivation of knowledge. It has to be our life. This Krishna consciousness, it's not meant to be just one of the many things that we do. It's not meant to be a hobby. It's actually meant to redirect our consciousness from self-centric to God-centric, redirect that, that misuse of free will from false ego to real ego, to give up this idea of I am independent from Krishna and return to the pure consciousness of I am the eternal servant of Krishna, and to act accordingly. If and when we come to this stage, then there's no more worries about the dualities of this material world. There's no more worries about the time of death. There's no more worries about any of this, because we will be situated in transcendence. So with that, I will stop here and see if there are any questions on today's class.
Hare Krishna Prabhu. Lots of questions.
Oh, good. I like questions.
When you, so at the very end, you said Krishna consciousness should be the center. It should not be one of the things we do. It should be the thing to do.
Yes.
And then you were saying we should transcend the three modes of, practically for me, how am I applying that is my question.
Oh, that's a good question. And it's one that we all need to understand. So essentially right now, and we've actually talked about this before, so what I'm about to say is going to sound very familiar to you because we've discussed it so many times. So essentially what we do is there are areas in our life that we are definitely connected to Krishna. We're following the orders of the Guru, regulative principles, we're chanting our japa, we may be doing some deity worship like that. So there's areas where we understand that, okay, I see Krishna's presence in these things. But there are also areas in our life where we don't see Krishna's presence, that we are spontaneously attracted and attached to doing these particular activities, whether it's for entertainment or for whatever, some sort of attachment we have that we don't see its connection to Krishna. So that means that we're dealing with the three modes of nature there. Now, in order to overcome that, is to engage it in Krishna service, right? We don't necessarily have to analyze, is this goodness, passion, ignorance, or is it mostly goodness with a tinge of passion and a very little bit of ignorance, or is it mostly ignorance? And we don't necessarily have to do that. But what we have to do is understand how that thing that we're attached to naturally and spontaneously because of our conditioned nature, how that thing actually can be used in Krishna service, right? And the way we do that is to understand that any quality in this world comes from Krishna, right? And so we understand that the thing that we value in that particular thing that we attach is actually just one of Krishna's potencies. And so the only thing we're doing wrong is we're seeing it as in relation to how it serves us, how it serves our senses, and not how it's meant to actually serve Krishna's senses. So all we're meant to do is understand, okay, basically, I'm a leaf. I see value in water. Instead of pouring that water on the leaf, because that doesn't actually distribute the nourishment, I pour it on the root, on Hrishikesh, the Lord of the senses, right? So we have to use the things that we value, the things that we're materially attached to, in Krishna's service. Once we do that, those particular layers of covering of modes of nature then become purified. And then we no longer have to deal with those particular ones. Now, we have many attachments, so don't worry. Once you get rid of one, you'll still have plenty more to purify. So that's there. But yeah, this is what it means, how it practically means to properly get through these things. Did that answer your question partially, or?
Yes. So when you're saying overcome modes of material nature, I was just thinking of it in terms of the traits I have. I didn't realize that when you're saying overcome modes of nature, we are actually, those are things that we need to get over, like my attachment to my children or my family.
Yeah, the attachments are based on material. In other words, they're things that we're attached to. Material nature is the thing that's making us attached to those, the modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. Because we've misidentified with the body, then we're being drugged around by the three modes of material nature, right? Because we're hiding from the light, from Krishna. And so due to our past karma from all these different lives, we have a very unique set of coverings of the three modes of material nature, and they take shape as whatever we're attached to, whether it's, watching movies or, doing whatever the case may be, whatever we happen to be attached to. And so the problem is the root of the problem, like Srila Prabhupada mentioned at the end of Mantra 1 purport, the root of all sin is deliberate disobedience of the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. So, in other words, I'm seeing something as how it serves me, not as how it is actually meant to be served in Krishna consciousness, right? And the root of spiritual advancement, as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur pointed out, is inquiry after the supreme reality. So when we start understanding how these things are to be engaged in Krishna service, then that's the root of spiritual advancement. So if we want to advance spiritually, then we have to see how everything is to be used in Krishna service. If we don't, then we're going to be dealing with the three modes of material nature, and they'll just keep dragging us around. So basically, and here's another good way to see how the modes of nature work, is there's this long-going debate, and we've discussed this too, about destiny and free will. Because these two concepts seem to be contradictory. Because if everything's predestined, then there's no question of free will, right? And if there is free will, then how could you possibly have destiny? But it's actually a fact, both exist. So the three modes of material nature basically are your destiny if you act according to your previous nature, your default setting, right? But if you inquire into the supreme reality, right, you start getting that nourishment from the root of spiritual advancement instead of the root of ignorance, then you can utilize your free will to do something against what you would normally do. So that essentially it changes your destiny, right? So when we all became devotees, we've experienced this thing. There were certain things that we would just always do. The situation came up, I would make this decision always, right? But then after coming in contact with the devotees and studying the Shastra, we understood that, okay, that's actually not the best thing to do. So instead I'm going to do this, right? And so we did something different. And our destiny actually changed, right? So now instead of following that path, just of the three modes, we also follow that path sometimes, but we generally, and at least when it comes to that decision, we're following the path of bhakti, right? And so where we've already made the connection, we're in good shape. But where we still haven't made that connection yet, we're still getting that nourishment from those three modes of material nature. And so to counteract that, we have to study more Shastra, take the instructions from the Guru, and then learn how to engage each of those things that we're attached to in Krishna's service. And in that way, those particular modes then become inactive because now they're engaged in Krishna's service. So they're no longer holding us down to material nature, they're actually elevating us to the spiritual platform. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But I can see that it is something. It's one thing to hear you right now, but a
Yeah.
whole another thing for it to actually sink in deep and
Yeah.
apply. Not as easy as.
Yeah, it's not something that you master in 20 minutes. There's a seminar I prepared a while, but I actually mentioned this too on the modes of material nature. I did part of it this morning because we just started 14th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, which is the modes of material nature. So there's this seminar that I prepared about the modes of nature. It takes probably 4 days. And it's a very interactive experience where, in other words, this basically the same knowledge that is given by, Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, given in a very hands-on interactive way. And basically we're conditioned to learn that way. So when we learn it that way, it leaves a samskar and it sticks with us a little longer. So if anyone's interested in that, maybe when I get back to America, I can do that seminar in Philadelphia. But it's a good way to understand how the modes are working, how they condition us, how to navigate through them, and how to effectively become transcendental to them. Because if we just get focused on the details of it all, then we become distracted. We think we're following something. Like, for example, this is the example I always give, is that vegetarianism, right? It's called a regulative principle, no eat meat, fish, or eggs. But it's actually a detail of the principle, which is only eat that which Krishna has accepted, right? We're Krishnatarians. And so you could be the strictest of vegetarians, but as Bhagavad Gita, what is it? 3:13, maybe? Yajna Shishtashana Shanto Muchante Sarvakilbisai. I'm not sure the verse number. But devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is first offered. Those who eat food for mere sense enjoyment, even if they are just vegetarian, the strictest of vegetarian, verily eat only sin. Right? So the point is not that, we have, that we're non-violent in our diet. Because if you are eating vegetables without offering them to Krishna, that is also violence, right? The vegetables also have life. And so they are meant for food, but they are meant to be offered first. So if we're not offering them, we're eating sin, right? So that's part of the root of sin. So I don't remember where we were going with that.
Difficult to practice.
So we'll get lost in the details, right? So in other words, we'll try to become even better vegetarians. We'll try to, increase that. But if we don't see that connection to Krishna, then it's lost. And the same thing with understanding the 3 modes of nature. We can sort of imitate those who have successfully gone beyond the 3 modes of nature, try to imitate the behavior of Arjuna, for example. But if we don't see his connection, the connection to Krishna, like I mentioned on the exercise at the beginning that I suggested, first we think of a devotee who inspires us, then we think of the particular quality, then we see how that quality is actually used in line with Krishna consciousness, not just, as being, etiquette, actually being engaged in Krishna service. And so when we see that, then we're dealing with the principle, not the detail, not the principle of tolerance, but the detail, not the detail of tolerance, but the principle of how it's actually engaged in Krishna service, right? And so when we do that, then we're in much better shape. Golokananda Priya, I saw you had your hand up, and I'm sorry I didn't call on you sooner.
Nice, okay. Yeah,
Okay.
how, like one question, in order to overcome the 3 modes of nature, we have to, if you surrender to Krishna, and make it easy for us to, to overcome it. But at the same time, in order to surrender to Krishna, that is a very difficult part also to come to the stage of,
Yeah, right. Which is why it's important to cultivate that knowledge. So the more we read Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, the more we actually understand Krishna as a person, who he is, and the more natural it becomes to surrender unto him. But yeah, that's a good point. Is that we hear this in theory. Those who surrender unto Krishna easily cross beyond it, but we're so ingrained in believing that we are independent from Krishna. We've been doing this since time immemorial, right? And the three modes of material nature are nourishing us with that idea because that's where our roots are. That's the root of sin, right? But if we inquire into the supreme reality, as Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur pointed out, then that is the root of spiritual advancement, right? So then we're getting nourishment from the point of transcendence. So that's how we make spiritual advancement. So it's just a matter of where we place our values, right? So here's another thing that, another exercise that I have people do. This is a very valuable exercise, is make a list of things that you value. Just write them down, things that I value. And we'll write down such nice points like I value, basically we'll list these qualities from 8 to 12, and then so many other things, and spiritual practices, and we'll have such a nice list. Then after you make that list and it's comprehensive and complete and you very much like it, and it's the thing that you'd like to hang on your wall and say, okay, these are the things I value, then you get to make another list. And this list is how you spend your time, right? So how do I spend my time? There's 24 hours in a day, so there's sleeping, there's eating, there's, and then we'll see that our time isn't actually spent on those items that we value or that we think we value. So what it really means is we value the other things on the other list actually more than the things that we at least theoretically want to value. So we're at that point in our Krishna consciousness that we want to value Krishna consciousness. We understand it has value, right? But we're engaging in things that are keeping us away from Krishna consciousness. So when we do that exercise and we see, okay, I can do better. In other words, I want to live according to that first list. I am currently living on the second list. So how do I get from here to there? So you just gradually increase the things that will get you to that point of that first list. So you start reading more, you start associating with devotees more. And not just associating with devotees in the sense that you're just in the proximity of devotees. It means you find like-minded devotees who encourage and inspire you. Like the first exercise I was talking about, you find a devotee who inspires you, and then see which qualities they possess that inspire you the most, and then actively try to absorb those qualities as a matter of association, because that's what association means. Sangha, which, since we were just talking about the 15th chapter and the weapon of detachment, it's asanga sastriya, the weapon of detachment. So detachment is asanga. So sangha is actually an attachment, right? So sadhu sangha, it's not actually sadhu sangha unless you actually have that connection, and you're actually taking those positive sat qualities from that sadhu and then absorbing them into yourself and displaying them, right? And so that's the meaning of sadhu sangha. So paying more attention to that and actually engaging in sadhu sangha instead of just, hanging around with people who believe roughly the same thing, but there's no transference of that sat principle, right? So we have to see that as well. And so when we start doing those things, then we'll start seeing that our life now, how we spend our time, is getting closer to the list that we made, the first one of the things that we value. And we can even change some of the things on the first list to make them even more dynamic and deeper, right? Once we have a deeper appreciation of those things. So we just have to be aware of where we're placing our values, not just theoretical values on that first list, but where we're spending our time and energy, right? Those are the things that we actually value, unfortunately, right? So it's no problem that we value those things, because everything can be used in Krishna's service, but we have to successfully stop using them for our own sense gratification and start using them for Krishna's service. And once we do that, then we're no longer getting nourishment from those particular modes of nature, and we are getting them from inquiring from the supreme reality through spiritual advancement. So the process is stated to be simple and easy. Pardon me. And it is actually easy, but it's difficult for us to let go of the concept of being in control, right? in control of my situation. Even when practicing bhakti, when we start making some advancement, right? The advancement, by the way, is because of Krishna's mercy. We become recipients, and then Krishna, helps us advance. But if we become proud of that advancement, we think, oh, just see, I made this advancement on my effort of bhakti, right? That's not what did it. It's not your effort that makes the result. It's Krishna's mercy. So our effort can make us a proper recipient. Basically, we can grab onto a rope, and that's it. And then Krishna pulls it up. And then if we become proud of climbing a rope when all we're doing is holding onto it, then that means we're not in Krishna consciousness, we're in self-consciousness. We think we're in control. So that's the biggest enemy, thinking that we are in control, right? Disregarding, as Srila Prabhupada said, the proprietorship of the Lord. We think we are the proprietor. We own it, we're in control of it. And as long as we think that way, then we haven't surrendered unto Krishna. And so we can't easily cross beyond the three modes material nature. But the cultivation is through Guru Sadhu Shastra. Is that a sufficient answer, Golokananda Priya?
Yeah, no, it's just a long process. We have to get the determination and the right associations, the right that you practice to come to that stage.
Yeah. Determination, inspiration from other devotees, encouragement, those all go a very long way. But if we're sincere, even so, in other words, you make those two lists, and if you're even just sincere about Krishna and you pray sincerely to Krishna, I really want to live life according to these values and not the ones that I'm actually living. Just with fervent sincerity, if we make that prayer, Krishna will send us the right devotees. He will give us the facilities to study more. We just have to sincerely pray. If we do that, these things will be given to us, and we just have to take them understanding that we're not the doer. Is there anything else? Or did you want anything else to say?
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Kaivalya Prabhu. He has unmuted himself. I thought maybe he had a question.
Oh, okay. Did you want to add something, Kaivalya Prabhu? Oh, did he leave? Is he gone?
No, he's still there.
Oh, he moved.
No, Prabhu.
Oh, there he is.
Thank you very much for your nice class.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else?
Everybody is letting the matter sink in, I guess.
Yeah.
Prabhu, it's a lot of information. I don't know how much I can digest in this.
I'll try to keep the next class a little lighter. It's just when I read the purport, I thought of all these other statements, and they fit together so nicely that when we see them all together and actually understand the depth of Srila Prabhupada's purport, it just helps us to see, okay, this is what the process is, this is how we engage it, and this is how we actually get to that result that Arjuna's in, right? Because otherwise, we read it and it's kind of, we get it as theoretical knowledge, and we appreciate it, and we aspire to get to that point. But as far as how to get there, it becomes difficult without understanding, these other points from the Acharyas. Kalpesh, Prabhu?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Please accept my humble obeisances. Very detailed class as usual, very enlightening. But I'm struggling with certain things. There is a struggle between a spiritual lifestyle and materialistic lifestyle, and I see it like the conditioning part of it. Just comparing the different grades of people. We all are used to some level of our own comforts in our own life, and when we practice the spirituality with that comforts, our demand is also the highest realization. We want to get it, And way I define the comforts are like the bodily demands, like eating the good quality of food, demanding tasty food, wearing comfortable clothes, having all like sitting places comfortable, sleeping place comfortable, high paying jobs, good bank balance, well-planned retirement account, car, weather controlling devices, well supplementals for medical uses, wellness exams for dental, eyes, and all, and using expensive gadgets. So these are the all comforts we are using it in the material lifestyle. And but we want to have the highest realization for spirituality at the same time by using it. And not necessarily every grades are at different like a different using in different, but we are somewhat using in that. So how would we fit in that renunciation of sense gratification? How would we know? Because everybody's comfort would be different, and in a shift of gear of comfort between this to that, really, I mean, when I struggle to find out like what is the renunciation of sense gratification would mean when we are really adopting our highest realization.
Yeah, good question. It comes down to faith. How much faith is there? Because the more faith increases, the more you realize you don't need everything on that comprehensive list that you gave. And the more you realize that Krishna is actually supplying those things, that we don't have to work to get them, that Krishna is giving them, right? So every other animal on this planet has everything they need. They have their shelter, they have their food, you know, they have their situation. We humans have we've come to believe that we've created a higher standard of living than the animals. However, we find out that what the effort that we have to put forth to maintain that standard is actually impossible. Whereas the effort that the animals, you know, do to just maintain their quota is quite easy. So it takes a bit of time to get from living in that lifestyle to gradually understanding what is actually necessity and what is not. But the renunciation doesn't mean that you have to get rid of those things. It means that you have to get rid of the idea that you're in control of those things. So you can have all of those things, every single thing on your comprehensive list you can have, but understand that it's coming from Krishna, that he's in control and he's taking care like that. And so that's the most important thing. That's the principle of devotional service, is understanding that Krishna is the doer and not us. So you may be doing a job, and through your job, you may be getting all of these different benefits and support and all that. But we have to know that it's actually all coming from Krishna, that not a blade of grass moves without his will. So if we're in this situation where in order for us to feel comfortable, we have to work, then we just at least understand this is coming from Krishna, but it's coming through my work. And then the more detached we become, the less we will need to rely on those things. And then we'll be able to see Krishna's protection in various other ways, aside from what was listed there. So it can be a gradual process, but the most important part is to understand that it's all coming from Krishna, that we're actually not the doer. It's not that you went through severe training to get a specific type of job so that you can get these proper, you know, medical, dental, optical, all these. If you think you're the doer, then that's would be missing the point. But you understand that Krishna is the doer. And so to whatever extent that you'll understand that, you know, he's doing it all, then gradually, then we become more and more detached from those things. Like I said, detached doesn't mean that we don't have them. It just means that we understand that they're not coming from us. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense. So also it raises the question of the like civilization. We want to living in a civilized society. So the idea is to develop the devotion and do the faith, like as you said. Like what would be the civilization, the basic necessities which we want is to strive forward with?
What would, are you asking what would civilization look like if everyone just lived off?
Yeah, if in a perfect world,
Perfect
the
world?
has to be perfect. Yeah, the perfect world. What would be the civilization would be?
Yeah, the way Krishna describes the perfect world is that everyone acts according to their nature. And so those who are situated in the mode of goodness, they just study Shastra and then they teach Shastra to others. Then those who are in the mode of passion means that they are able to produce things, right? Then they build up society and they take care, because mode of passion means that you can also give protection, right? And so there even are cities. It's not that everybody lives in a field. You know, some people they need different accommodations, right? And so those are there in the kingdom, the bigger kings. You can see Dwarka was a city, Mathura was a city like that. Hastinapur, big city. And so those in the mode of passion, then they create that field, and then so the others can be peaceful. And then if you have a mix of passion and ignorance, then that means that you're able to produce something, but you also feel the need to have stability, right? So in other words, the ones who are in the mode of passion, they allot you a particular area, and then you work within that area comfortably, right? And then you can make some profit, or like that. And then those who are mostly in ignorance, they just assist everyone else. So they're taken care of because they perform, according to their nature, they perform an activity, and in exchange for that performance of activity, they get a very specific payment for that, and so they can maintain themselves. So that's how the entire society in an ideal world runs. And then, everyone goes to those in the mode of goodness for advice. They go to the ones in the mode of passion for protection and for facility. They go to the ones in the mixed passion and ignorance to get their commodities. And they go to the ones mostly in ignorance to get their particular specific work done. And so if that didn't sound obvious, I described Daivi Varnashram Dharma, Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras. Yeah. So that's what it looks like. And all the necessities are there because Krishna gives everything. And then so if you're just working according to your nature, everything's good. The problem with today's society is that the position where there should be Kshatriyas, administration position, we have Vaishyas. So instead of protecting the citizens and providing for everything that they need, instead they are just exploiting because they want to make profit, because that's what Vaishyas do. They figure out a way to make profit. And so if you put a Vaishya in a Kshatriya post, instead of creating and maintaining laws based on protection, they create and maintain laws based on profitability. And so there's exploitation. So that's why this system is currently making us all believe that in order to have a happy life, we have to work a very specific kind of job with a specific kind of benefits, etc. So because someone that's not qualified to be in that post is in that post, we are in anxiety because we're not being protected, we're being exploited. And so we're just trying to be exploited as less as possible. And so we come up with a comfortable situation. And so it's very difficult to think of Krishna in that way. But if we live in a society as designed by Krishna according to our nature, and we actually have people who want to protect the citizens in those posts, then we're quite comfortable with where we are, and we don't have to worry about saving up for this and saving up for that, and what about this emergency, and what about if this comes up, etc. So we can live that in a microcosm, in a smaller society, since society at large isn't going to adapt to that anytime soon. But in an association of devotees, we can get to that point. And in the meantime, like I said, we just live our lives the way that we're conditioned to, but add Krishna consciousness into the mix. And then gradually we become purified by that. But yeah, ideally we would just engage our natures in a even if it's a small society, even if it's a small community, if everyone's doing their part according to their nature, then everything will run quite nicely.
Okay. Yeah, because most of these things are dictated by the society because we are in that association. That's right, very appropriate. The Varna ashram is the way to get civilized because that will minimize our demands and it will be more conducive towards devotion because ashrams are meant for those. Okay. Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna, thank you. Yeah, so it means if we're not focusing on Krishna, then we are getting our nourishment from the three modes of material nature, as pointed out before. Okay. Anything else? Okay, yeah, I think we went over a little bit.
For good reason. Thank you, Prabhu.
Always happy to do it.
We'll see you again next week, I guess, on Monday.
Yes, okay. I'll try my best to keep it to maybe only one thought-provoking point. I'll try. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
No,
You
do
just say
you
what
do
best.
You're the best.
We need to
We'll
know
see what the
what-
verse says. Whatever the verse says, that's what we'll do. But I'll try to keep it a little simpler, easier to digest.
That's what I want. But to do whatever your class is very good, Prabhu.
Thank you.
Whatever
Thank you.
your mind says, do say like that only. We want to.
You're very
have
kind.
to clean it up. You don't come to down. You have to go up. And
Oh, it's not coming down. It's just presenting part of it instead of all of it. I have a tendency to try to bring it all in, but I'll try to simplify next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Panchakalpatarubhyasya
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Prabhuji.